Why is Germany so developed? There are people in some countries who believe that you can only get around Canada by dog sledge, that people in Africa only live in straw huts, and that the internet only exists in North America. In Europe, most people realize that there are cars and electricity all over the world and all the circumstances that go with them. But why is Germany so developed? Or perhaps not when it comes to fiber optic expansion.
Welcome to YD. Why do Germans do things the way they do?
In the Stone Age and Antiquity, the Germanic tribes were not known as the great inventors, although even then important trade routes ran through what is now German territory. However, the Romans are said to have imported plenty of soap from Germany. As was known at the time of the Hanseatic League in the Middle Ages, goods were transported, traded, and processed from the east via the Baltic Sea, or from the north from Scandinavia, from the south from the Alps, or from the west from France or the North Sea. In fact, just like today, Germany is a transit country for many goods in Europe. The major rivers such as the Rhine, Main, and Danube were navigable and important trade routes, while marketplaces and towns emerged at the few crossing points such as Frankfurt, Erfurt, Cologne, and Munich. The largest inland harbor in the world is located in Duisburg on the tributary of the Ruhr into the Rhine. Even today, many goods are shipped on the Rhine, and the Ruhr region, with its history in coal and steel, got its name from the Ruhr for a reason. Naturally, knowledge and information also traveled with goods. Latin became the unifying language of trade in Europe. With millet from Asia, a second crop could be brought to the fields after wheat or rye, and thus a second harvest in the same year. Centuries later, potatoes and maize were added. Because the church maintained universities where priests and legal scholars were trained, written knowledge was needed. Books were reproduced in countless monasteries, and the more people could read, the more writings were needed. Using Chinese printing technology with individual characters and a wine press, Gutenberg invented letterpress printing with movable type in Europe. When you live in the middle of it all, there are also frictions with your neighbors. Whether small fights or major wars, people always try to be at the cutting edge of weapons and armor technology. Iron and steel for weapons and armor became increasingly important. Wound doctors also learned a lot on the battlefields in Europe. The Germans have always endeavored to achieve good quality. In the cities, regulations were drawn up or demanded by the guilds as to what a product should look like. Apprentices learned how to achieve this quality. When the steam engine was invented in England at the beginning of the 18th century to drain the ever deeper mines, machines were purchased there, and the first was used in the princely gardens in Kassel in 1722, and then in the mines from 1744. It was not until 1785 that the first steam engine of Watt's design was built and used for this purpose in Hettstedt. The knowledge came to Prussia through industrial espionage. In order to protect against imitations later on, it was stipulated in Great Britain in 1887 that goods from Germany had to be labeled "Made in Germany." What was initially intended to be disgraceful became a seal of quality. Over time, people tried to find more uses for the steam engine, and in 1804, the first steam engine was used on rails in South Wales. However, it was not until the wars against Napoleon that feed for the numerous horses became scarce, and the idea of using the steam engine for transport of goods and passengers was again considered. In 1816, locomotives were used to transport materials in Prussian steel works. In 1825, it was back in England that the first steam-powered locomotive hauled a train with passengers on a fixed route in regular service. Stephenson locomotives became the best sellers all over the world, and the 1435 gauge became a common standard. It was also a Stephenson locomotive, the Adler, Eagle, that pulled the first commercial passenger train in Germany between Nuremberg and Fürth on the 16th of November 1835. In 1861, Johann Philipp Reis presented the telephone in Frankfurt and made the first telephone call on German soil. In 1866, Werner Siemens built the electric generator to produce electricity. However, it was not until 1877, after the first telephone connections were established in the USA, that the first connections were also built in Germany. Things really got going in 1881. In 1885, the first power station was put into operation in Berlin, which also supplied electricity to private customers. In a way, electricity and the telephone go hand in hand, and of course, it always starts in big cities. The telephone is, of course, a means of communication that, unlike the post, lives from the fact that many people participate. The more people have a telephone, the more I benefit from a telephone connection. The first international connections from Berlin to Paris were established around 1900. Until the 1970s, the connections via copper cables were basically the same as in the 19th century, only the operator was replaced by automated connections by 1972. They had a dial disc and later also buttons. This was at least true for the FRG, as telephones were not so widespread in the GDR, at least not as a private connection. Often several people shared one connection, or there were telephone boxes, as in West Germany. There was a mobile phone network in Germany as early as 1958, and by 1970 it covered 4/5 of the Federal Republic of Germany. Around 1986, the C network was designed for around 500,000 users, and the telephones weighed about a pound. What all the developments in Germany had in common was that they were promoted and partially controlled from the highest level. The Prussian king had steam engines installed in the mines after a commission had set up. The expansion of railway networks was also a state task. The Bundespost expanded the telephone network throughout Germany. After reunification, numerous house connections were also possible in the new federal states. Unfortunately, Helmut Kohl prevented the expansion with fiber optics at the time. Imagine having fiber optics back in 1990s. Then, sometime later, it was thought that it was better to leave everything to the free economy. The Bundespost was split up into the postal service with its letters and its subsidiaries, DHL, the telephone provider Telekom, and Postbank, which has since been bought up by Deutsche Bank. If you want to have a connection in areas that are not yet equipped with fiber optics, you have often to sign a contract with a provider before the connection is laid, who may then expand there in 1 to 5 years. This means that in densely populated areas there are still 3 fiber optic cables next to each other, while in sparsely populated areas the local authorities have to wait for the major providers to deny their expansion plans so that a subsidized expansion can finally begin. It was similar with the Transrapid Magnetic Levitation Railroad. Fast, safe, pioneering. But if the whole country already has a good railway network and also high-speed trains such as the ICE, this abbreviation stands for Intercity Express and is also used to transport foreigners through Germany, then there's little need for a complete different type of railway. For example, the Transrapid was never put into operations here. But the railways were also supposed to be privatized and were split into different companies as a precaution. However, these companies are still owned by the federal government, but there are now also private providers that run on the state-owned railway lines. The providers of the drinking water supply and the owners of the sewage network are mostly the local authorities themselves. This means that it's not a company that wants to make profit in order to pass them on to the shareholders, but the local community itself, whose representatives are regularly elected in election and who live in the community themselves. Especially where people live in a good mix of rich and poor, everyone pays attention to the infrastructure. Fortunately, there are virtually no gated communities here. Because Germans are so fuzzy and quick to complain, manufacturers have to deliver good quality. When the first cars came from abroad, it was quickly criticized that French cars rusted too quickly, cars from Japan didn't last long, or cars from Spain weren't well made. All this was quickly improved, and cars from all over the world are now driving on German roads. The ERP software on most business computers is from SAP in Walldorf. Here too, the software first had to satisfy German customers, and then it was easy to continue. The knowledge of developments came to Germany with trade, which fortunately is right in the center of things. Knowledge was initially disseminated by the churches when people were still almost 100% Catholic or Christian. This rise of science led to people taking a more critical view on the Christian worldview and paying more attention to scientific findings. Compulsory education began because the monarchs realized that a well-educated population was worth more than simply workers without any education who helped industrials to make quick profits. It was therefore also clear that school was a communal task, which is why schools and universities are still mostly state-run and free of charge for the individual. Pressure from a self-confident, educated labor force via trade unions, associations, and social democratic parties, as well as a stable middle class, led to more social welfare. After the Second World War and the destruction in the country, it was money from the USA for Europe that helped West Germany to rebuild, while industry was partially dismantled in East Germany for reparations. The joint work culminated in prosperity, from your own television to the family car to holidays in Italy. Although trade unions and employee associations regularly argue about the appropriate wage, in difficult times they also work together to preserve factories and jobs and help those who have to change jobs to make the transition, something that some foreign investors do not understand. Until the 1980s, there was a so-called Deutschland AG, which involved the interlinking of banks, above all Deutsche Bank, insurance companies, most notably Allianz, and industrial companies such as MAN, BASF, Daimler-Benz, Volkswagen, and many more, which on the one hand held shares in each other and on the other held several supervisory board positions. It therefore made sense for a bank to give a company a favorable loan because the bank would also benefit from the company's dividends. At that time, it was seen in a positive light that German companies, banks, and insurance companies were doing well in an international comparison because it was also economically advantageous. On the negative side, the number of supervisory board positions held by a small number of managers increased. The increasing internationalization of the capital markets, especially Deutsche Bank's investment banking, all with the aim to make even more profits even faster, led to the end of this cooperation. The German Stock Corporation Act also limited the number of supervisory board mandates per person and even further in recommendations. We are still seeing the effects of this today. As already mentioned, the private expansion of fiber optics network means that metropolitan areas are well connected, but rural regions are still poorly developed. The companies simply have no interest in giving everyone access, but only when it's worthwhile. On the other hand, the gas network, which is regulated, is in good condition, and the money that flows into it and can be invoiced is calculated by a central authority in such a way that every operator makes a small profit if it maintains the network, but nobody is allowed to charge too much money. The electricity grid in the European network is very secure and is being expanded further, partially because the focus is shifting towards renewable energies. In the 1990s, there was also a strong solar industry with the state subsidies in Germany, which then almost died out again due to a lack of support from the government. However, centralized ownership does have one disadvantage. If the state or municipality lacks the money, they sometimes cut back on new constructions or simply on maintenance. You can still drive on the road, we just patch up a few potholes. The roof of the school is still sealed, so we do not have to do anything for the time being. If these funds are saved over years or decades, at some point the roof will no longer be watertight and the bridge will be dilapidated and then to be completely replaced. This can be seen in the investments that are currently necessary and even the new debts that are being taken on for this so-called special assets, Sondervermögen. It's not necessarily any different from private companies. But unlike the states, they simply have a company dissolve, possibly go bankrupt and build a new one somewhere else where it is cheaper. The old plans can then simply rot away, and at some point the municipality will have to take care of them. So it's a mixture of a good geographical location, both sea access and mountains, lots of forests and no deserts, plus being right in the center because if I want to go from Western Europe to Eastern Europe, I have to go through Germany or over the Alps. A certain amount of raw materials, such as coal, iron, and salt, but not too much to trade with others. Certain importance of political players, from the German king, who was emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, to the sovereigns of Baden, Saxony, and Prussia, numerous trade relations, a clear legal situation, and the realization that knowledge and cohesion are important. That's why Germany is so happy to be in the EU because it brings so many advantages in trade, from good sales market to favorable production locations. The most interesting point about the whole question is actually that many Germans don't see it that way, that we are so well developed. Not that we are not well developed, but we always see the things that do not work out. And if we have another pothole in the road, the whole roads are bad, and if there's no broadband in our street, it's nowhere to be found. So it's always nice to see immigrants or foreigners talking about the difference between Germany and their home country. Germany usually doesn't come off too badly.
Remarks, addition, and comments in the comments. Thank you for your attention. See you in the next video.